Jasmine Crockett straight in the eye and shouted, "Go back to Africa!" The entire room froze. The cameras rolled, and America witnessed one woman unleash her fury, while the other answered with history. With nothing but her voice and her truth, Jasmine shattered decades of denial within the marble halls of power. How could an insult meant to silence one woman end up shaking an entire nation to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. wasn't a room anymore. It was a trap, spring-loaded and ticking down. Cold lights bore down from the ceiling, flattening every line on every face into something harsh, exposed. Cameras crouched along the walls like mechanical predators, their lenses wide open, waiting for blood. A low murmur vibrated through the air, not conversation, just tension bleeding out of human skin. The heavy oak table stretched like a battlefield between two women who could not have stood for more different Americas. Jasmine Crockett sat at one end, her spine straight, her hands still, every inch of her screaming, "I am not here to apologize." Across from her, Karoline Leavitt adjusted her papers, sharp, jerky motions, her polished smile already cracking at the edges. Around them, aides moved stiffly, the scratch of pen on paper too loud, the shuffle of a chair unbearable. Every breath taken in that room felt rationed, careful, loaded with the knowledge that one wrong word would ignite the whole thing. Jasmine wasn't here for herself alone. She was carrying the gravity of stories never told, verdicts never overturned, names never cleared. She could feel them behind her, like a wall, ancestors in shackles, mothers in courtrooms clutching crumpled subpoenas, boys shot for walking wrong on the wrong street. She didn't need to be told the room wasn't made for her voice. The walls themselves whispered it. Karoline knew it too, and that knowledge flickered behind her eyes like a silent alarm she refused to acknowledge. Today's hearing was supposed to be about judicial reform, but everyone in that room could feel the truth pressing down harder. It was about belonging, about who was allowed to claim America as theirs without qualification. The chairman's gavel slammed down, a crack that sounded too much like a rifle shot, and the room jolted as if the floor had shifted. Jasmine inhaled once, slow and deep, steadying the roar in her blood. Karoline's hand tightened slightly on her pen, the movement small but unmistakable. The war had already started, and not a single word had been spoken yet. The air tightened so much that even the silence seemed to vibrate. Every heartbeat in the room beating in step with an invisible clock, counting down to the moment everything would break. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slightly, the tiny movement magnified 100 times by the tension crackling across the room. Her voice was calm, but cut clean through the heavy silence, like the first crack of thunder before a storm breaks. She wasn't reading. The facts were alive inside her, carved into years of cases she had fought, stories she had carried. In majority black districts, she said, her voice low but unwavering, sentences are on average 34% harsher compared to white districts, even when the crime is the same. No one interrupted. No one dared. Jasmine didn't flood them with statistics. She laid them out one by one. Each fact dropped carefully, like laying bricks for a house the room was being forced to live inside. In states like Louisiana and Mississippi, defendants of color are twice as likely to be wrongfully convicted compared to white defendants. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. The weight of what she was saying pressed harder with every word, each syllable sinking deeper into the foundation of the hearing. Every chair creaked slightly as people adjusted, not from boredom, but because sitting still under that kind of truth started to feel unbearable. Jasmine kept her gaze steady, scanning the room, daring anyone to look away from the reality she was building in front of them. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking. She was testifying. She pointed out that federal reviews had documented patterns year after year, showing how communities of color received harsher treatment at every level, from arrest to conviction to sentencing. And she did it without a single tremor in her voice. It wasn't anger speaking. It was exhaustion. It was experience. It was the knowledge that facts alone had never been enough to make some people care. But that didn't mean you stopped speaking them out loud. She turned a page on her folder slowly, the sound sharp in the silence. Bias is not a ghost, she said. It has fingerprints, names, faces. A few aides scribbled notes, pretending the words weren't cutting through their composure. The weight in the room built so thick you could feel it sinking into your chest. Then, just when Jasmine opened her mouth to continue, the interruption came, hard, fast, and sharp enough to feel like a slap. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward too, her voice cold, flat, weaponized. Maybe you should study your African roots before trying to teach Americans how our laws work, Karoline said, the words slipping out, smooth and deliberate. Not a misstep, not a stutter. The room didn't just fall silent, it froze. It was the kind of silence that felt physical, heavy, like the air itself had been punched out of the room. For a moment, everything stopped. Jasmine, mid-breath, stared across the table, her hands still folded neatly in front of her. Not a flicker of shock, not an outburst. Just a deep, cutting awareness that everyone else was now being forced to feel too. Heads turned, eyes widened. A camera zoomed in silently, catching every tightening jaw, every slow blink. Somewhere near the back, an older black staffer shifted in his seat, his hand gripping the armrest tight, knuckles whitening. Near the press bench, a young reporter's pen hovered midair, forgotten. The words sat there, thick and sour, too real to be taken back, too loud to pretend not to hear. Nobody moved, nobody dared. In that frozen second, all the old rules people used to politely ignore racism, plausible deniability, coded language, backhanded compliments, were useless. The insult was out there now, raw and naked under the lights, and there would be no pretending it hadn't happened. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't lean back. She didn't lash out. She simply tilted her head slightly, a gesture so small yet so cutting it made the tension even heavier. Her voice came out low and calm, not soft, but sharpened to a deadly edge. "Would you mind repeating that?" she asked, each word measured, cool, deliberate. It wasn't a question born from confusion. It was a challenge, a dare, laid out in front of everyone, like a loaded weapon placed gently on the table. The kind of question that demanded an answer, so that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it the first time. For a long second, Karoline didn't move. But then, pride pushed her forward, like a hand between her shoulder blades. Karoline Leavitt pushed herself up from her chair, the legs scraping loud and ugly against the polished floor. She didn't hesitate. Her face didn't flinch. She lifted her chin and threw the words out into the room, with all the brittle force of someone who had never been made to carry the weight of what she said. "If you think America is so unjust," Karoline declared, voice rising loud and clear over the stunned room, "then maybe you should go back to Africa." The sentence hit the room like a metal door slamming shut. People jerked in their seats. Some froze, halfway through scribbling notes, pens hovering uselessly above paper. A cameraman near the back sucked in a sharp breath, loud enough to be heard. The words weren't a mistake. They weren't a slip. They were a weapon, aimed and fired, with the steady hand of someone who believed there would be no consequences. The microphones caught everything, no static, no distortion, no chance for spin. The broadcast feed didn't blink. Across America, in living rooms, on phones, in busy cafes, millions of people heard it in real time, raw, naked, undeniable. In the hearing room, the air turned poisonous, heavy enough to make lungs ache. Some people sat stunned, staring at Karoline as if she had pulled a mask off and revealed something uglier underneath. Others chuckled under their breath, a low, smug sound that sounded like doors slamming shut in someone's face. One congressman in the back corner shook his head slowly, lips pressed into a thin line of disgust, while a woman 2 rows down muttered a prayer into her clenched fists. Across the committee table, A young black aide swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly against his notepad. Not from fear, but from rage so old it didn't even feel sharp anymore. Just heavy, like iron chains looped around the ribs. Jasmine saw it all. The gasps, the smirks, the tightening hands. And she sat still, absorbing it, letting the truth of the moment settle into the bones of the room. She knew this wasn't new. It was only louder now. Broadcasted, played in real time. This was the America she had grown up learning to navigate, with precision, with armor invisible but heavy. And now the whole country was watching, not just what had been said, but what she would do next. Jasmine moved forward, each step heavy with meaning, her heels tapping against the marble like a slow, steady drumbeat, announcing a shift that everyone could feel, but no one could stop. She didn't rush. She didn't speak right away. The silence itself seemed to lean toward her, hungry for what was about to come. The bright lights overhead caught the sharp lines of her dark blue suit, the gleam of the small silver cross at her collar, the set of her jaw, carved from pure will. Cameras followed her automatically, but no one needed the lens to tell them where the center of gravity had shifted. She stopped at the heart of the room, not behind a desk, not shielded by papers or protocol. Just standing there, herself alone, every inch of her rooted like a monument that would not move. She raised the microphone slowly, not for show, but with the patience of someone who knew that, when the truth is ready, it does not need to shout. Her voice, when it finally came, was deeper than anyone expected, steady and slow, and it filled every crack in the room. "I was born in Texas," she said, and the words fell like the first heavy drops of a storm breaking a long drought. "My father wore an American military uniform." She let that sink in, giving no one a place to hide. "My mother wore a nurse's badge." Her voice didn't tremble. It carved its way forward, quiet but unstoppable. "And my ancestors?" She paused, long enough to force every head to lift, every eye to meet hers. "They wore iron shackles." She didn't say it like a plea. She didn't say it for pity. She said it like a fact, too big, too old, and too terrible to be anything but carried. They were chained, packed into ships like cargo, stolen across oceans, and forced to build the very foundation of the country we now sit in. There was no sound but the faint hum of the cameras, the scrape of someone shifting uncomfortably in the far corner. Jasmine's gaze swept the room, slow and unblinking, her silence daring anyone to flinch. Her voice grew quieter but heavier, each word weighted like a stone placed carefully onto the chest of every person listening. "You tell me to go back to Africa?" Her tone colder now, the edges sharpened by a history too often ignored. "My blood, my family's blood, is soaked into this soil deeper than any flag planted hereafter." She took one half step closer, not toward Karoline, but toward every hollow excuse hiding in the room. "I don't need to go anywhere." Her voice cut the air cleanly, like a blade drawn without hesitation. "My family paid for this land with chains, with sweat, with bone, with lives. We built it, we bled for it, and I will not be told to leave it by someone who inherited it without ever having to fight for it." In that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer an insult. She dismantled it, piece by brutal piece, until there was nothing left for it to stand on. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not yet. And the stillness in the room grew heavier as she reached slowly for the folder lying on the desk beside her, as if preparing to pull a final blade from its sheath. Jasmine's hand moved with a slow, deliberate precision that made the room feel even tighter, like a wire being pulled closer to the breaking point. She picked up a thick black folder, the bold stamp across its cover practically burning under the harsh lights. "Confidential, Internal DOJ Compliance Report, 2019. There was no drama in the way she handled it, no theatrical flourish, only a grim certainty that made the silence sharpen. She opened it carefully, the faint sound of paper shifting somehow louder than any voice in that moment. Every set of eyes followed her hands now, wide, wary, as if bracing for something they could no longer pretend wasn't coming. Jasmine didn't look down at the documents as if discovering them for the first time. She handled them like an old wound, familiar but still raw. Holding up a page, she let the weight of the silence stretch until it hurt, then spoke, voice low and exact. This report was prepared during the time Karoline Leavitt held a position at the Department of Justice. The words hit harder than any shouted accusation. Jasmine didn't pause to savor the reaction. She pressed forward, her tone steady and merciless. Specifically, during her assignment shaping communication strategies and internal policy messaging related to judicial outcomes. She didn't need to raise her voice. The facts were heavy enough to do the crushing for her. Across the long oak table, Karoline's posture stiffened, her fingers twitching slightly where they gripped the armrests of her chair. In the gallery, journalists leaned forward in unison, pens forgotten, screens glowing, the click of cameras replaced by an almost reverent silence. Jasmine let the weight of the open file settle between them, and when she spoke again, it was not with anger, but with the cold, methodical finality of a judge delivering a sentence that could not be appealed. She lifted the first page slowly, the paper crackling slightly in the still air, and began to read, without embellishment, without hesitation. According to this DOJ compliance report, her voice cut through the silence like a slow-moving blade. African Americans received prison sentences 34% longer than white defendants convicted of identical crimes. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The number itself slammed into the room like a sledgehammer against old, cracking walls. A faint rustle moved through the audience, a few stiff movements from aides trying too hard not to react. But Jasmine pressed on, her cadence even, as if each word had been measured and weighed before being allowed to leave her mouth. She turned the page with deliberate care, the sound scraping across the tension like a knife against bone. Wrongful prosecutions, she continued, her voice growing colder, more precise, occurred at double the rate in neighborhoods predominantly made up of Black and Latino residents compared to predominantly white neighborhoods. Every fact hit harder than the last, not shouted, not dramatized, delivered flat, mercilessly, the way truth demands. Jasmine paused, letting the information hang, heavy and undeniable. Then she reached for another sheet, her fingers steady, her face carved from stone. Internal communications reveal, she said, explicit acknowledgement that external political pressure pushed for intensified law enforcement actions specifically within minority communities. Her tone stayed dry, but the air in the room had changed, thicker, heavier, like the moment before a dam breaks. She turned another page without a glance up, each movement reinforcing that what she carried wasn't accusation, it was evidence. The objective, she read, her voice barely louder than a breath yet somehow filling the entire space, was to maintain public confidence among key voter demographics by showing a tough stance disproportionately at the expense of communities of color. Jasmine closed the folder softly, the finality of the gesture louder than any gavel strike could have been. She stood there a moment longer, the document resting against her side, like a quiet weapon she no longer needed to brandish. Her gaze lifted then, slow and unflinching, sweeping the faces lined up before her. Some lawmakers looked away instantly, their eyes falling to papers, to phones, to the floor. Anywhere but at the woman who had just laid bare what they had spent years pretending was too complicated to fix. Others sat frozen, caught between shame and fear, their carefully rehearsed public faces slipping under the weight of exposed reality. Even the political allies of Karoline Leavitt, who moments ago had laughed or scoffed, now stared hard at the table in front of them, as if the grains of wood could offer them an escape from their own complicity. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't need to. Every word she had spoken still hung there, heavy and sharp, a series of blades suspended over the heads of those who thought history could be rewritten by volume alone. In that moment, the hearing room didn't feel like a place for debate anymore. It felt like a courtroom, and Jasmine Crockett, standing in the center, had become something far more powerful than a witness. She had become the living proof of every truth they had tried to deny. The silence after Jasmine's last document snapped shut was thick and suffocating, the kind that didn't invite a response, but demanded an answer none of them were prepared to give. Jasmine didn't back away. She didn't soften her voice. She let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until the weight of it forced every head to lift and every face to turn toward her. Then she spoke, her words slow, clean, and heavy enough to leave marks. "You tell me I should leave?" Jasmine said, her voice calm but slicing through the air like a knife through taut rope. She let the question hang, daring it to settle into the lungs of everyone who had laughed, everyone who had looked away. Her eyes never wavered, steady as a blade drawn for judgment. "Maybe," she continued, her tone sharpening, each syllable deliberate, "you should spend more time reading about the crimes you helped cover up." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were heavier because she delivered them without heat, without noise. Only with the cold precision of someone who carried generations of silence turned into steel. The weight of what she said didn't spark outrage or rebuttal. It sparked something much more devastating. Recognition. Raw. Ugly. Immediate. Karoline Leavitt sat paralyzed in her chair, her body rigid, her hands clutching the armrest so tightly the veins along her wrists stood out. The practiced smile she wore earlier had completely collapsed, leaving only a blank mask struggling to contain the turmoil inside. Her face, normally vibrant with self-assurance, had lost all color, the blood draining out as if Jasmine's words had stripped away every shield she thought she had. She blinked once, then again, but whatever retort she might have prepared shriveled before it could reach her lips. Her throat bobbed in a dry, panicked swallow. Her breathing, once even and measured, came now in shallow, ragged pulls she couldn't fully hide. Cameras zoomed in mercilessly, catching every twitch of muscle, every flash of helplessness, recording the exact moment when pride shattered and left nothing behind but raw exposure. Karoline's mouth opened, just slightly as if to form a rebuttal, but no sound came, only silence. Heavy, damning, absolute. She lowered her eyes at last, staring at the desk in front of her, like it might somehow offer shelter, but it didn't. There was no shelter left, not from Jasmine's words, not from the truth that now filled every corner of the room like smoke after an explosion. The silence inside the hearing room might have held, but beyond those marble walls, the world had already begun to roar, and Jasmine Crockett's quiet demolition of Karoline Leavitt was about to ignite something far bigger than anyone inside could have imagined. The clip hit the internet like a spark dropped onto dry grass. No warning, no time to contain it. Within minutes, Twitter feeds exploded, hashtags piling up faster than anyone could scroll. On TikTok, the footage looped over and over, Jasmine's calm, lethal words cutting through the noise. Karoline's silence bleeding out across millions of screens. YouTube channels lit up with reaction videos, breakdowns, frame-by-frame analysis of the moment a young black congresswoman dismantled an entire facade of denial with nothing but facts and a steady voice. Some people clipped the moment Jasmine said, "Maybe you should read about the crimes you helped cover up," and replayed it like a national anthem. Others spliced it into montages of civil rights marches, protests, historic speeches, as if to say, here in this moment, the fight had never stopped. Every few seconds, another phone vibrated, another comment thread exploded, another wall of the old silence cracked open wider. Across the country, the reaction was not polite, it was visceral, raw, real. In a small diner outside of Birmingham, Alabama, an elderly black man watched the clip on a cracked phone propped up against a ketchup bottle. His hands shook slightly as he pressed replay. Again, again. Not because he had missed anything, but because he needed to feel it one more time. The weight of dignity standing unbroken under fire. At a public library in Detroit, a group of college students huddled around a laptop, their midterms forgotten, their arguments about theory replaced, with the shared electricity of seeing someone speak a truth they had been taught to survive but never to say out loud. In a high school classroom in Phoenix, a history teacher paused mid-lecture, turned the projector toward the live feed, and let the students watch, not explaining, not preparing them, just letting them sit in the moment and feel the current of history moving through their screens. Veterans posted videos from their living rooms, some in full uniform, others just in old worn baseball caps from wars fought long ago. "We fought for freedom," one Marine Corps veteran said, his voice gravel rough but steady. And Jasmine Crockett just showed the kind of courage that doesn't come from a weapon. It comes from knowing the ground you're standing on is already paid for. Teachers wrote open letters thanking Jasmine for giving their students something real to believe in, something that wasn't a sanitized paragraph in a textbook. Union workers, nurses, engineers, retired grandmothers, people who usually didn't bother with political hearings, found themselves watching, sharing, reposting, with captions like, "This is how you fight back," and "Strength is standing still while the storm tries to swallow you." But not every reaction was simple or celebratory. In living rooms where generations had swallowed the idea that respect was bought by silence, there were tears that didn't come from sadness, but from the shock of recognition. In a small town outside of Kansas City, a mother sat her teenage son down at the kitchen table, pulling up the clip on an old laptop. They didn't speak for a long time after it ended. Then she simply said, "You have a right to be here. Always remember that." In Chicago, a group of older men who met every morning at the same coffee shop to argue about sports sat in heavy silence after watching the clip play out on the TV mounted over the counter. One man, usually the loudest, just shook his head slowly and whispered, "About damn time." Jasmine's words didn't just stay trapped in the hearing room. They spilled out into every place where the quiet, buried things of America lived. They moved through the factory floors, where workers punched clocks but swallowed pride, through the late-night diners where single moms wiped down counters and kept their heads down, through the lecture halls where students were taught the mechanics of government without ever being told how it really felt to be ruled by it, through the living rooms where veterans sat with aching knees and folded flags and wondered what it had all been for. Jasmine's voice was not angry, not pleading. It was the voice of a reckoning that had been postponed too long, arriving at last without apology. Within hours, cable news caught up. Headlines shifted. Crawlers beneath the talking heads changed tone. Pundits, who had expected a minor, contentious exchange, now scrambled to frame the moment, some trying to minimize it, others trying to spin it. But the footage spoke louder than any panel discussion could. Jasmine's calm, unwavering face became a symbol splashed across every major platform. Not as a radical, not as a firebrand, but as a mirror held up to a country still wrestling with its own reflection. In the comment sections, buried between the usual vitriol and bots, real people poured out real stories about being followed in stores, about being pulled over for nothing, about job interviews lost to names too complicated or skin too dark. Jasmine had spoken in a chamber built for laws, but her voice had broken through into the places where laws alone had never protected enough. At a Veterans Hall in Raleigh, North Carolina, a retired Army sergeant replayed the clip on a loop, showing it to anyone who came near. "You see that?" he said, tapping the screen. "That's American. That's what we fought for. Not the noise, the standing." In Miami, a high school senior created a digital art piece in Jasmine's honor, an image of her standing in the Capitol chamber, with roots stretching from her feet deep into the earth, through chains, through cotton fields, through courtrooms, through battlefields, all the way back to the broken ships that had crossed the ocean centuries ago. The piece went viral within a day. Somewhere in a quiet suburban living room, a young girl watched Jasmine's clip on a borrowed phone, under the covers past bedtime. She whispered the words out loud to herself. "I don't need to go anywhere." She said it once, then again, until it sounded like something she could wear like armor. By the end of the next 24 hours, Jasmine Crockett's name was trending across platforms, not just for what she said, but for how she stood. The clip wasn't treated like a scandal. It wasn't twisted into partisan noise. It became something rarer, something that people carried in their pockets, sent to their friends, whispered about at dinner tables. A reminder, a reckoning, a line in the sand. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., long after the cameras had stopped flashing and the hallways had emptied, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, looking out over the nighttime skyline. She didn't smile. She didn't weep. She simply sat there, still and steady, carrying the silence the country could no longer pretend it didn't hear. But beyond the trending hashtags and endless replays, something even more powerful began to unfold. Quiet, raw, and deeply human. Real people in real rooms feeling seen. For the first time in ways no speech alone could ever reach. In a small living room in Des Moines, Iowa, under the dim light of an old ceiling fan, a white man named Tom Reynolds sat beside his teenage son, the glow of the television screen flickering across their faces. Tom hadn't planned to watch the hearing. He had stumbled across the clip by accident, scrolling through sports highlights, his thumb hesitating when he saw Jasmine Crockett's name trending. Curiosity had pulled him in. What he hadn't expected, what he wasn't ready for, was the way the room seemed to shrink around them as they watched Jasmine stand there, unflinching, delivering truth with a stillness that roared louder than any shouting ever could. Tom's hands, calloused from years working construction, tightened into fists against his jeans as Jasmine spoke about her ancestors, about iron shackles, about blood paid for a country that still asked her to leave. His son, 15 and gangly and too often sarcastic, didn't make a joke. He didn't shift restlessly. He just sat there, his face pale, his eyes wide, watching. When Jasmine said, "I don't need to go anywhere," Tom felt his throat close up tight, too tight to swallow. His son reached over, without a word, and gripped his father's hand. Tom squeezed back, hard, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them pretended not to understand the weight they had just witnessed. Tears blurred Tom's vision, hot and shameful and cleansing all at once. And when he glanced sideways, he saw tears streaming silently down his son's face too. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. That moment said everything they hadn't known how to say until now. Thousands of miles away, in a sun-bleached front porch chair in Selma, Alabama, Miss Loretta Jennings, a woman who had marched for voting rights in the 60s, who had seen too many speeches and too few changes, sat with an old tablet balanced carefully on her lap. Her fingers, bent and stiff from arthritis, moved slow but sure across the screen. As she pulled up the now viral clip, she watched Jasmine speak, not yelling, not begging, not performing, just standing there, with that steady fire burning low and deadly in her chest. Miss Loretta leaned back, the wood of her chair creaking softly under her weight, the humid air thick around her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, slow and deep, the way old trees bend in the wind but never break. She remembered 1,000 moments when silence had been weaponized against her, when polite cruelty had carried the sharpest knives. She remembered learning that sometimes the most powerful protest wasn't a march or a song. It was refusing to bow your head when they told you you didn't belong. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her Facebook page, her profile picture still the same faded church snapshot from 5 years ago. She clicked into the status box, her hands shaking slightly with the weight of everything she wanted to say, but knew no words could capture. So she kept it simple. Director, unapologetic. She typed, "Not everyone needs to shout. Sometimes one steady look is enough." And then, just beneath it, she added a single link to the video. She hit post and set the tablet down on the side table beside her sweet tea. The night air settled heavy around her, but for the first time in a long time, Miss Loretta let herself believe, maybe not for herself, but for the ones coming after, that some fights didn't have to be fought with fists or flames. Sometimes they could be won by standing still and refusing to be erased. More and more stories poured out, like cracks running through old concrete. A teacher in Michigan described watching the clip with her students, who sat in stunned silence after the final words dropped. A retired police officer in Louisiana, haunted by years of knowing better and doing less, wrote an open letter thanking Jasmine for the dignity she refused to surrender. On TikTok, teenagers stitched together clips of their own family members, immigrants, veterans, factory workers, watching Jasmine's speech and nodding, sometimes with smiles, sometimes with quiet tears. In small towns and big cities alike, people who had never agreed on anything found themselves sending the same link, whispering the same stunned phrases. Did you see her? Did you feel that? She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She just stood. And it wasn't just Black families or Latino families or immigrant families. It was factory workers in Kentucky who knew what it meant to be treated like less. It was veterans in Pennsylvania who knew the cost of a flag and who recognized courage when they saw it. It was students in California who had been told to wait their turn, to lower their eyes, to stay polite in the face of injustice. Jasmine Crockett's voice had slipped past the walls of the Capitol building, past the guarded headlines, and into the bloodstreams of people who were tired of waiting, tired of asking, tired of being told that change would come if they were just patient enough. Tom Reynolds shared the clip on his Facebook page, something he rarely did, writing simply, "Watch this with my boy, we cried, we learned." Miss Loretta's post, meanwhile, spread quietly but fiercely, shared by church groups, college students, retired civil rights lawyers, young activists who had never heard of her before, but who knew wisdom when they saw it. Her words, "Sometimes one steady look is enough," became a rallying cry of its own, not shouted from podiums, but murmured across dinner tables, whispered in classrooms, typed in comment sections beneath Jasmine's video, where strangers told their own stories, finding connection in the space where truth had cracked the old world wide open. In less than 48 hours, Jasmine Crockett's steady stand had become something far more dangerous than a viral moment. It had become a mirror, and people all across the country, for better or worse, were being forced to look into it. While the world outside erupted in outrage, solidarity, and reckoning, Karoline Leavitt sat alone, silent, cornered, and facing a reckoning of her own that no camera could capture. The room felt too large, too empty, the polished wooden table stretching endlessly in front of her, like a cold, judgmental witness. Karoline Leavitt sat motionless at the far end, her hands limp on her lap, the hearing chamber now stripped of its audience, its cameras, its noise. No aides hovered nearby to whisper strategy into her ear. No colleagues lingered to offer whispered encouragement or crafted excuses. The polished doors that had once swung open with self-assured importance now loomed shut, sealing her off from the frantic world outside. She was alone, not just physically, but in the deeper, heavier way that only comes when the layers of justification fall away and leave nothing but bare truth. The adrenaline that had once propelled her sharp answers and proud posture was gone, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She stared at the blank surface of the table, but it offered no guidance, no comfort. There were no talking points left to summon, no spin left to apply. Only the sharp, brutal memory of Jasmine Crockett's words cutting through her, still bleeding somewhere unseen. Karoline squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the echoes, but the silence only made them louder. She pressed her palms against the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened, desperate to hold on to something solid, something real. And that's when the memory crashed over her. A memory she hadn't summoned in years. A memory she had buried beneath ambition, rhetoric, and carefully crafted detachment. She was 16 again, standing outside the principal's office, her heart pounding with a sick, frantic rhythm. She had been caught with a group of kids she barely knew, arrested for trespassing on private property after a night of reckless teenage bravado. Her parents had been furious, embarrassed. No one had wanted to hear her side. No one except Mr. Daniels, the history teacher with the slow voice and the patient eyes, the one the other kids sometimes mocked for being too soft, too serious. Mr. Daniels, a black man in a school where almost no teachers looked like him, had stepped forward when no one else did. She could still hear his voice, low and firm, telling the principal that Caroline deserved a second chance. That one mistake at 16 shouldn't brand a girl for life. That sometimes good kids made bad choices and didn't need their futures shattered for it. Because of him, the charges were dropped. Because of him, she wasn't expelled. Because of him, she had gotten to go to college, to step onto the carefully paved road that had led her all the way here. She remembered standing in his classroom after the meeting, too ashamed to meet his eyes, and hearing him say, "Everyone stumbles, Caroline. What matters is what you do next." She had nodded, sworn to herself that she would honor that chance, that she would carry it forward. And now here she was, 33 years old, sitting alone after a public humiliation she had crafted with her own hands, replaying words she could never unsay. Caroline pressed her forehead into her hands, the weight of it all threatening to crush her into the polished surface of the table. She realized with a sharp stab of clarity that made her stomach churn, that she hadn't just insulted Jasmine Crockett. She had insulted Mr. Daniels. She had insulted every hand that had reached out in kindness when she hadn't deserved it. She had thrown their faith in her back at them, wrapped in mockery and arrogance. The shame was physical, a heat rising from her chest to her throat, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't the manufactured shame of a bad news cycle or a failed interview. It wasn't strategic embarrassment that could be spun and polished away with a careful statement. This was raw. This was the gutting shame of a truth finally catching up to a person who had spent too long running from it. She saw herself clearly now, not as the polished staffer, not as the rising political star, not as the fighter for traditional values. She saw the small, frightened girl who had been saved by a man she hadn't defended when it mattered most. She saw the woman who had betrayed the better parts of herself without even realizing when it had happened. Caroline leaned back in the chair, her muscles aching from the rigid posture she had forced herself to maintain all day. She felt stripped bare, as if the armor she had built for years, made of rhetoric, pride, and carefully curated distance, had been peeled away in front of everyone, leaving nothing but raw skin exposed to the cold. The images from the hearing flashed through her mind. Jasmine's steady voice, the rising tide of silence, the way even her own allies had refused to meet her eye after the final blow had landed. There had been no rallying around her, no defense, because deep down, they all knew. And worse, deep down, so did she. The minutes dragged by, measured only by the slow, mechanical tick of the antique clock mounted on the chamber wall. Caroline stared at it, feeling each second hammer against her ribs. She thought about issuing a statement, spinning a narrative about miscommunication or being misunderstood. The old reflexes tugged at her, but somewhere inside a quiet voice, one she had drowned out for too long, rose stubbornly through the wreckage. Maybe this wasn't something she was supposed to spin. Maybe this was something she was supposed to sit with. Maybe for once the right thing wasn't about winning the next news cycle. Maybe it was about finally telling herself the truth. Her phone buzzed on the table, lighting up with messages from handlers, lobbyists, party officials. She didn't pick it up. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the shame settle deeper. Let it soak into the places pride had once protected. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if redemption was possible. But for the first time in years, Karoline Leavitt didn't feel like an operator or a fighter or a brand. She felt like a human being who had failed someone who had once believed in her, and worse, had failed the better version of herself she had once sworn she would become. She opened her eyes slowly, staring at the silent room around her. The same chairs, the same wood-paneled walls, the same cold marble floors that had once felt so sure, so solid beneath her feet, now felt foreign, distant, unfamiliar. She wasn't sure when she would stand up. She wasn't sure what she would say. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She could never pretend again that this hadn't happened. And whatever she chose next, it would be chosen with open eyes. No more hiding behind borrowed strength, no more cheap justifications. For the first time in a long time, Karoline Leavitt wasn't thinking about saving face. She was thinking about saving something far more fragile, something she wasn't sure she even deserved anymore. Herself. While Karoline sat trapped in the heavy aftermath of her own undoing, elsewhere in the city, Jasmine Crockett was stepping into a different kind of spotlight, a place not built on anger or applause, but on something far rarer, hope forged through fire. The hall was smaller than the grand chambers of Congress, but felt infinitely larger in spirit. Simple rows of folding chairs stretched out beneath warm yellow lights, a makeshift stage at the far end, decorated only by a banner reading, Future Leaders Scholarship Awards. No marble pillars, no velvet ropes, just plain, honest space filled with the electric hum of young energy barely contained. Students lined the front rows, clutching certificates, resumes, and dreams stitched together from long nights of study and even longer days of doubt. Parents stood near the walls, some wiping at proud tears, some holding phones aloft to capture a moment they had fought too hard to see finally unfold. At the edge of the stage, organizers whispered anxiously into microphones, adjusting programs and checking watches. They weren't sure if Jasmine would come. After all, the country was still reeling from the wildfire she had inadvertently set. But then the back doors opened, not with fanfare, not with press, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who understood that real battles aren't won in grand gestures. They're won in rooms like this. Jasmine Crockett entered wearing a simple navy suit, no entourage trailing behind her, no reporters snapping photos. Only the low murmur of realization spreading as heads turned, one by one, toward her. A young girl in the third row gasped quietly, her hands tightening around her scholarship certificate like it might float away. Jasmine moved with the kind of calm that didn't demand attention but refused to be ignored. She shook hands with the organizers, murmured polite thanks, and took her place behind the plain wooden podium at the center of the stage. There was no teleprompter, no prepared speech, just a stack of folded papers she barely glanced at. The room shifted, the chatter dying down into something thick, anticipatory. Jasmine waited until even the fidgeting students fell still, the weight of her presence anchoring every breath. When she spoke, her voice didn't thunder. It didn't crack the walls or shake the windows. It moved differently, heavy, steady, deliberate, the way mountains move when they shift deep underground. "I want to tell you something tonight," Jasmine began, her voice low but carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I don't need an apology." She let the words land, solid and unyielding, before continuing. "I need a shift in thinking." There was no judgment in her tone, no bitterness. Only the cold, hard clarity of someone who had fought long enough to know where true victory lies. Jasmine scanned the faces before her. Brown, black, white, hopeful, frightened, determined. And she let herself breathe in the enormity of it. These weren't just scholarship recipients. They were the future battlegrounds, the future victories, the future heartbreaks. Every one of them would carry this night into a world still reluctant to make space for them. Every one of them would know the invisible weight she carried in that hearing room, and they would have to find their own ways to stand beneath it. She placed her hands lightly on the podium, her voice steady as she said, "Sometimes we think the way forward is through anger, and there is power in anger. But sometimes what wins the long fight isn't how loud you roar, it's how long you endure." A ripple moved through the audience. Not applause, not murmurs. Just a tightening, a deepening of attention, like everyone was leaning closer without realizing it. Jasmine drew in a breath, feeling the raw honesty of what she was about to give them. Something stripped of slogans and polished talking points. "You will be tested," she said, her voice roughening at the edges now, not with emotion she couldn't control, but with truth too heavy to disguise. Not once, not twice, over and over. "You will be told to wait, to be quiet, to be grateful for crumbs." She let that hang in the air because she knew every student in that room had already felt it, even if they hadn't yet found the words. "You will be told your anger is the problem. You will be told your hope is naive. You will be told your presence is disruptive. A boy in the back row, no older than 17, blinked rapidly, his shoulders set hard against an invisible weight Jasmine knew too well. She softened her voice just slightly, enough to cut through the rising lump in more than one throat. But don't let them steal your steadiness, she said. Don't let them shame your endurance. Sometimes you will win, not because you shouted the loudest, but because you refused to move when they told you that you didn't belong. The students stared at her now, like she was speaking directly into the oldest, hardest parts of themselves. The parts that had survived rejection, survived being overlooked, survived being told in 100 small ways that they were too much and not enough all at once. Jasmine smiled then. Not wide, not for the cameras, but the small, fierce smile of someone who understood the battlefield beneath their feet better than any strategist in any war room. You are not here by accident, she said, her voice deepening into something like a promise. You do not have to apologize for your dreams. You do not have to apologize for your presence. You have already earned your place by daring to stand. A long silence followed, the kind that didn't feel empty but sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Jasmine stepped back slightly, letting her final words settle like seeds dropped onto ready soil. She didn't wave. She didn't pose. She simply nodded once, respectfully to the crowd, and stepped away from the microphone, her heels clicking against the stage floor in slow, steady beats. The applause started small, uncertain at first, as if everyone was still trying to find their voice after being handed something too big to process immediately. But then it grew, stronger, deeper, roaring not just from obligation, but from the place inside where real gratitude, real recognition lives. As Jasmine disappeared backstage, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel it, the shift, the crack, the slow, unstoppable turning of something that could never be turned back. In that room on that night, Jasmine Crockett didn't win a headline. She didn't win a moment. She won something harder. She planted endurance into hearts that would carry it forward long after the news cycle forgot her name. And sometimes that was how real battles were won. Outside the modest hall, night had fallen over Washington, D.C., but the world beyond those doors was already shifting. Small and visible at first, like the first crack in a dam that would not hold for long. The air outside was cool, the city breathing under the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Jasmine Crockett stood on the sidewalk for a moment. No security detail, no media swarm, just her, the night, and the echo of young voices still ringing faintly from the hall behind her. She slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat and looked up at the sky, clouded but vast, the stars hidden yet surely there. Somewhere inside her chest, the weight of the last few days pressed heavily. But tonight, for the first time, it felt different. Not the burden of fighting alone, not the exhaustion of surviving rooms meant to break you. Tonight, it felt like standing at the edge of something about to break open, not to destroy, but to finally let something larger flood in. Across the street, a small group of students lingered under a flickering street lamp, clutching their certificates, laughing in that uncertain, giddy way that only comes when you realize the future is suddenly, terrifyingly real. One girl spotted Jasmine and froze, her friends elbowing her forward with nervous giggles. Jasmine caught the movement and smiled gently, a small nod that said, "It's okay." The girl hurried across the street, sneakers scuffing the pavement, her hands trembling slightly as she approached. "Ms. Crockett," she blurted out, voice breaking from nerves. "Thank you. You—" Her words faltered, tangled up in emotions too big for the narrow tunnel of speech. Jasmine reached out, steady, placing a warm hand on the girl's shoulder. No cameras, no audience. Just a moment passed from one fighter to another, from one survivor to another. "Don't thank me," Jasmine said quietly. "Just keep standing." Behind them, the city hummed. Buses groaning down avenues, windows glowing with life, old bricks holding on to generations of struggle and change. Jasmine knew the headlines tomorrow might forget this night, knew the news cycles would spin away into fresher outrage, newer scandals. But she also knew that what had happened here tonight wasn't built for headlines. It was built for memory. It was built for the long game, for the long, slow, relentless turning of history by hands that refused to let go. As she turned and began walking slowly down the street, away from the hall, Jasmine's mind drifted, not to victory speeches or news interviews, but to smaller things. A teacher's worn-out shoes shuffling down a hallway. A young father's calloused hands gripping his daughter's homework tighter. A tired mother's late-night whisper, "Keep going." In every small act of endurance, in every stubborn refusal to give up, she knew the real battle was being fought. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally tipping. Farther downtown, in a newsroom buzzing with last-minute edits, a producer watched the clip of Jasmine's speech for the 5th time, frowning thoughtfully. At a university campus 2 states away, a political science professor scrapped his planned lecture notes, deciding instead to play the full hearing, uncut, for his morning class. In a dusty living room in Tennessee, an old woman knitted by the light of her TV, the news muted, but Jasmine Crockett's face lingering on the screen, solid and sure. The ripples spread outward, not loud, not explosive, but steady. Steady in the way that mountains are steady. Steady in the way that revolutions, real ones, are born not from one great moment, but from 1,000 small ones stitched together by people who refuse to look away. At a quiet corner of a memorial park, Jasmine finally stopped, her breath curling in the cold air. She leaned against a stone wall, etched with the names of battles long past, names of people who had once been told they didn't belong, who had once been told to go back, to step aside, to stay silent. She pressed her palm flat against the cold granite and closed her eyes. "I don't need your apology," she whispered to the night. "I need your change." Behind her, the city buzzed on. Before her, the long road stretched, dark and uncertain. Jasmine Crockett straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped forward into it without hesitation. She knew the battle wasn't over. She knew it might never be. But she also knew this. Some wars aren't won with shouts. They're won with steps, one after another, until the world finally learns to listen. And Jasmine Crockett had already taken the first one. But even as Jasmine disappeared into the night, her steady footsteps left behind a question far larger than any headline could hold. A question every witness, every viewer, every silent bystander was now being forced to confront. What does it truly mean to stand? In the wake of it all, the clash, the silence, the storm, and the stillness, the true lesson did not live in the sound bites or the trending clips. It lived in the spaces in between, in the quiet reckoning that came afterward, long after the applause faded. It lived in the raw, uncomfortable truth that justice is not a performance, and dignity is not granted by permission. Jasmine Crockett had not demanded power. She had not begged for acceptance. She had stood, calm, unmoved, and in doing so, forced everyone else to decide who they really were when the lights were no longer blinding and the noise could no longer drown out the truth. Her battle was not against a single insult or a single enemy. It was against something older, something deeper, a system of casual cruelty built to teach some people that their belonging was conditional and others that their power was absolute. The human lesson carved from this moment was not about winning arguments. It was about refusing to let the terms of humanity be rewritten by the loudest or the cruelest voice in the room. Jasmine showed that the hardest victories are not explosive. They are endured. They are earned quietly, one breath at a time, by those who choose against all odds to remain standing when it would be easier, safer, even more profitable to sit down. She didn't shame her opponent with rage. She didn't outshout her. She outlasted her, with truth, with patience, with a courage too deep to be rattled by petty provocation. And in doing so, Jasmine reminded a fractured country of something it keeps trying to forget, that the real test of character isn't how loud you can be when you're winning. It's how steady you can remain when the whole world hopes you'll break. Every injustice Jasmine exposed that day, the sentencing disparities, the wrongful convictions, the political manipulation of law, was not new. It was ancient. It was inherited. But she forced a nation that had grown skilled at pretending otherwise to look at it, naked and undeniable. She forced them to see that injustice doesn't survive because it is strong. It survives because too many people decide it's easier to look away. Too many people decide that truth told quietly can be ignored. Too many decide that history is someone else's problem to fix. But Jasmine's stillness was a refusal, an iron-willed, soul-deep refusal, to allow that lie to stand unchallenged. And in the echo of her words, every bystander, every viewer, every comfortable politician was left to grapple with a terrifying, liberating truth. Silence is never neutral. The battle Jasmine fought wasn't about pride. It wasn't about ego. It was about memory. It was about carrying the weight of every ancestor whose chains had built the streets she walked on, whose blood had watered the soil beneath the Capitol dome. It was about knowing that every time she stood silent but unbroken in the face of arrogance and dismissal, she was reclaiming stolen ground. Not with fists, but with presence. Her restraint wasn't weakness. It was warfare of a different kind. It was a lesson written into her bones by generations who had survived not because the world made space for them, but because they carved out their own spaces anyway, against all odds. And the message Jasmine left behind was not just for the ones who looked like her, or prayed like her, or came from the same hard-fought places. It was for everyone. It was a reminder that belonging is not something you ask for. It is something you claim. It is something you live. And it is something you defend not by proving yourself to those who doubt you, but by standing anyway when the ground shakes and the walls close in. Jasmine didn't need Karoline's apology because she understood something far more dangerous to the comfortable order. That the apology wasn't the prize. The changed mind wasn't the prize. The act of standing was. In every classroom where a teacher paused a lesson to show the clip, in every living room where a family watched in stunned silence, in every comment section where strangers reached out with trembling words they didn't know they needed to say, the real victory grew. Silent, relentless, inevitable. Not in grand speeches, not in breaking news alerts, but in the small, stubborn way. Truth changes people when they are finally forced to sit with it and realize it was never about being perfect. It was about being present. It was about showing up again and again, even when the world told you it would be easier not to. Because the greatest revolutions don't start with noise. They start with refusal, refusal to shrink, refusal to apologize for existing, refusal to allow someone else's limited vision to define your worth. And Jasmine Crockett's refusal that day lit a fuse deeper and longer burning than any outrage cycle could capture. In the end, the lesson was simple and devastating and beautiful. You don't always need to shout to leave a scar on the walls of injustice. Sometimes you only need to stand, calm, steady, and unbreakable, and watch as the world cracks itself trying to move you. And when that happens, when the dust finally settles, the people who tried to erase you will realize too late. You were never the one who needed to move. It was always them. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.